Glad to be here. I'm going to start off with kind of more at a high level, not dig in yet to the GSA matters that will be handled by the experts here. But I'm grateful to be here and wanted to start with an overview of the Central Valley project and why it matters to you in the community, because it's not always obvious in the work that you go around and talk to folks on the ground. They want to farm and be productive, and they want water in the fields. They don't necessarily need to have a great understanding of the larger California water system. But all of a sudden, as you're all realizing, it's starting to come to roost here, where the state is starting to enforce stigma, and there's a lot of questions, right? Like, why are we in this situation that we're in? And I'm here to tell you that it's not a surprise that we're in the situation that we're in. And it's not just not a surprise because of what's happened over the past 15 years. It's not a surprise because of what we all knew 100 years ago. And the first slide I have up, and I'm going to show a lot of slides. Don't worry that you're not going to be able to capture all the detail. I'm mainly showing them to illustrate some key points that I can just point out on graphically. And every time I do one of these, I realize that as soon as Microsoft decided to have PowerPoint in the landscape instead of portrait, California was in a real disadvantage. Because it would be really good to either be able to have a portrait or to just flip it around and have California on the side, which we might as well do because the government's trying to do it anyway. So, okay, so enough on that. What I wanted to show here is something that you probably already know. This is a map that shows the general precipitation, where it lands in the state. And if you didn't know this, you should, that about 75 to 80% of all of the precipitation and rainfall that the state receives is Northern California, north of the Delta. And about 25% falls south of the Delta, Southern California and the Central Valley. Well, why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem because we took advantage of not only great living conditions in Southern California, but fantastic farming conditions in the Central Valley, such that now 75 to 80% of our water demands south of the Delta. Again, nothing new. 100 years ago, we were already looking at that, or more, late 1800s, saying, you know, what we really need to do is harness this Northern California water and bring it to where we can put it to some amazing beneficial use south of the Delta in the Central Valley, and eventually also the Southern California. So that's an important point, because when you look then at a map that if you are tracking the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act at all, or it will happen today, you've probably seen this map from the Department of Water Resources. The red in there is primarily in two hydrologic regions that are shown on this map. But the top one in blue is the San Joaquin River hydrologic region, which is everything north of the San Joaquin River in the San Joaquin Basin. And then everything south there is the Tulare hydrologic region. And you notice that the further south you go into the Tulare hydrologic region, it gets more red. Those are the areas of critical groundwater infiltration over the past several decades, and getting even worse. So that is we're right there. We're in Tulare County here. You're all familiar with that. We're in the most critically overdrafted area in the state of California. And so that's why we have so much attention on us in the state as it relates to SGMA. So I mentioned this is not a new issue. Don't worry about exactly what all these lines are, but here's why I'm putting them up. The bottom line is the last pretty much 100 years from 1922. This one shows only to 2015. That's the amount of groundwater overdraft cumulative since 1922. Over 150 million acre feet of water. has been overdrafted. There's more pumped than what's replenished in the groundwater, just in the Tulare Basin. So think about 150 million acre feet doesn't mean a lot to you. Think of Millerton Lake. The entire lake, when it's full, like if you drove up there today, it's spilling over the spillway. It has 520,000 acre feet of water in the entire lake. So that's a lot of full Millerton lakes that have been overdrafted out of the Tulare Basin alone. So this is not a new issue. It's the reason why, when the government was really trying to help us, you have to go back a while. There was the construction of projects to try and deal with this issue because it's unsustainable. One of the reasons we knew it was unsustainable was because the ground was sinking right under our feet. This was a slide, that photo taken right in the middle of the San Joaquin Valley, where the gentleman at the bottom was standing where the ground level was in 1977, and on the very, very top of the telephone pole was where the ground level was in 1925. And so that was subsidence at its worst for that area, and it highlighted the need to do something serious about that issue. Now we see it at varying levels of subsidence all throughout the valley. In some cases, in some areas, it's worse than others. So I want to explain quickly a general overview of what this Central Valley project is, why it should matter to you, how it impacts this area at home, and why you should care about it as it relates to compliance with SGMA moving forward. So like I mentioned, back in the 1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s, it was already being surveyed. Like, look at all the rivers in Northern California and how much water. In fact, there were huge flood problems in Sacramento area that needed to be dealt with. But also there was a vision of how that water could be put to beneficial use in the Central Valley. So the 1940s, completion of Shasta Dam up near Redding, Friant Dam near Fresno, the Jones pumping plant in the Delta, in the San Francisco Bay Area, and a lot of canals to move the water around. That was completed. I'll get back to why that block of projects is very important for this area. That was completed in the 1940s. Then there's a realization the American River was plentiful with water, also needed to be controlled up in the Sacramento area. So Folsom Dam was completed in 1956. The Trinity Division was another dam completed actually to divert Klamath River water north of Redding and divert it through a tunnel into the Sacramento River Basin. In 1967 was the completion of, you've probably seen San Luis Reservoir, also impressively full this year, always good to see, over by just west of Los Banos. So the San Luis unit and the State Water Project. State Water Project came to Corville Dam up at Corville. Also moved water south of the Delta. San Felipe unit and New Maloney's Dam was the last big construction. San Joaquin Valley state. So this is this map here just shows and highlights where it is. The span of all the way from Redding, Shasta Reservoir, 4.5 million acre foot reservoir. So almost 10 times the amount of storage over the lake. And it was constructed in the 1940s. So let me talk about why this project is important to this area. And it deals with that first clump of projects in the 1940s that involves Friant Dam. So here's a picture of Friant, and actually, other than the river in this photo, is a little bit more full than it is today. If you went up there today, you would see the lake about that full and the spillway into the river. Not that that's a good thing, but it's good in the fact that we have a wet year. It's bad because we don't have enough storage to hold all that. We don't work here. One thing I should point out about Central Valley Project and all those facilities, including Friant Dam. These projects were built by the federal government, the United States, through an agency called the Bureau of Reclamation. Bureau of Reclamation, federal agency. If you drive by on Friant Road, drive past Friant Dam, you'll see the big sign, got the Bureau of Reclamation sign. That's why they own Friant Dam. And the other, they can only build a project like if they have number one, congressional authority to go build it, congressional appropriations, money to go build it, but also they have to have, and they have to have contracts with those who are going to use the water before they would build the project. They have to have contracts to repay the facilities in total. So all those appropriations, not free money, have to be repaid back, and agree to pay all the operation maintenance every year on the project. So for those in this area, my agency, Friant Water Authority, we operate and maintain the Friant Canal, which if you're not familiar with, runs from Friant Dam. You can see it there in the bottom right. Friant Canal runs from Fresno to south of Bakersfield, 150 miles. Still owned by the Bureau of Reclamation, but contractors that take water from the canal have contracts that were mostly signed in the 50s. And they're responsible to repay all the costs of all the O&M and for the actual purchase of the construction of the facility. That gives them the right to have the water supply from the canal. So if you ever sense any tension between those that have the contracts to take water from the canal versus those that don't, well, they signed up for it 70 plus years ago in some cases, and they paid for it, and they have the right to that water. Not to say that others can't have access to it, and definitely need to have access to it, especially in years like this. So this, again, in California, even the Central Valley, disadvantaged by not having Microsoft Dome landscape. But I wanted to just show that the Friant service area is that area in the dark green. The yellow spot in the kind of upper part of it is the city of Fresno. The bottom yellow spot is Bakersfield. So basically, the whole east side is scattered throughout of contractors that take water from Frankfurt Canal. And there's over 1 million acres of farmland that rely and take water from Frankfurt Canal. So this is not to scale. This is a cartoon. To make a point of the size of Friant compared to what comes in the reservoir. I mentioned 520,000 acre feet is the capacity of the reservoir. Now, about 135,000 acre feet of that sits on the bottom as what we call dead pool. Really, it's never used. So really, there's only about 385,000 acre feet of space that we can fill and use and fill and use and fill and use. Well, the average inflow into the reservoir is about 1.75 million acre feet a year. So there is not even enough storage in Millerton for 1 year's worth of water. In fact, every year if we use it all, on average, we're turning the reservoir over 3 times. And of course, if you follow hydrology from year to year operations and such, you would realize that there's no such thing as a normal year. Like we'd be jumping up and down if we ever got a 1.75 million acre foot year. We had years like 2015 that was about 300,000 acre feet, almost nothing in the reservoir. And years like this, where we're going to get over 4 million. And you know, for me, trying to work with the Bureau of Reclamation and manage 4 million acre feet when we've got 380,000 acre feet of storage, it is physically impossible. And we're trying to put as much in the canals. But we do end up spilling on average about 450,000 acre feet a year. That number is getting lower with the San Joaquin River Restoration settlement flows having to go down the river. So part of that 450 is floodplain going away. All right, I'll throw those there. So what I wanted to highlight with this next chart here is every one of these bars represents delivered water to the Friant division out of Friant Dam in a year. So the first far left is 1977, far right is 2017. The reason I showed this is that you can see there's really no such thing as like an average year of deliveries. It's an average of 1.2 million acre feet since 1977. But you will only get 1.2 million acre feet if you can really get a lot of that wetter year water. Otherwise, our standard for deliveries is about 800,000. So being able to capture that wet year water is critically important, getting that average amount of water up. So that's why I want to highlight this. Now, interestingly, the presentation I went to grab this slide, which we're updating to capture 2019 and last year, 2022, and everything between. I grabbed this slide from a presentation where we were presenting on Temperance Flat Reservoir, which I'm not here to talk about today, but I think you can see just the build up to this point, how it would be a beneficial water management tool to have more storage upstream of Friant Dam. I mean, it's indisputable that it would be beneficial. It would be expensive, be controversial, take a lot of time. It's not something that will ever come online and save this area from the doldrums of Cyclone, but it's something that should be continued, have on the radar, because it's not going to get any easier over time. And we're going to continue to need to capture the floodwater. So Friant Water, one of my points up to this part of the presentation is just to articulate that it is very important to this region to continue to capture as much of that surface water as possible. Because if that starts to go down, we need it to go up and not the river area, but it starts to go down. The only way to make up the difference is through more groundwater pumping. And for those of you, everybody dealing with the groundwater law issues knows that we don't want to start having to rely on more groundwater. That's not going to happen. So delivering Friant water, very, very important to the region. So another thing, okay, so I finally grabbed a slide here. I flipped California. Now you're looking to the east. It's like you're flying in on the Pacific Ocean and you're coming up through the Bay Area, and Friant here is right in the center. And so you got north to the left, south, just to fit in here. What I wanted to show is, remember one of my first slides where I said Shasta, Friant, and the pumping plant at Delta were all constructed together in the 40s. That's because they were dependent on it. The United States in the 1940s, actually in 1939, purchased all the water rights along the San Joaquin River, all of them, and reserved just a little bit of flow that would continue to go through the San Joaquin River water rights holders. But in 1939, they exchanged that. They said, we're going to take all the water. And in exchange for that, people that rely on water down along the San Joaquin River will receive a substitute supply. The substitute supply is what is going to come from Shasta Reservoir, released, controlled into the Sacramento River. And Shasta, again, Redding, we're talking Redding. Takes forever to drive to Redding, right? But that's where Friant water is dependent on water stored in Redding. Shasta to come down to the Delta through the Sacramento River, up through the Jones pumping plant. So by gravity, Sacramento River to the Delta, and then it's got to get pumped uphill to Los Banos area and put in the Delta Mendota Canal so that it can reach near the town of Mendota an amount of water every year that has to be delivered in order to have Friant be able to get its water out of North. For 70 years, it never once failed. That exchange never failed. And then in 2014 was the first time the Bureau of Reclamation could not meet all of its substitute supply from Shasta through the Delta to the Mendota Pool. So what was it supposed to do? Well, the Bureau had no clue what to do. So what they did, and they did the best they could to follow all these contracts from 1939, was they released basically all the water out of Norton Lake down the river to meet the needs of those that had the riparian right historically, which was not following the contract. That was made in 1939. In fact, probably every one of you can sit down and read the contract in 1939, and it says exactly what will happen if the substitute water falls short. They should have released water. They did, but they did not follow the contract. And so when you hear that Friant is suing the government, and there's a big controversy even within the water community, it's not that we don't agree that water should have been released, it's the contract was not followed. And it made a difference for what water that we bought from Millerton Lake. We're very passionate about it because it is it's very inappropriate that the government did not even attempt to do a good job of following the contract, because we all know the contracts, they're very important for us so that we can have security and make deals. But having said that, that's the lawsuit, if you ever hear about that. But since 2014, that's happened 5 times now. 700,000 acre-feet of water has been released from Friant since 2014, because not enough water could make it from Shasta to make this exchange. That water is coming right out of this basin. And so it highlights the importance of being able to make this exchange work. And the reason I bring it up here is just to highlight the importance of what's happening in the Delta and what's happening at Shasta, and why the Delta delivery matter to this basin, because it is taking water away from Millerton, which is taking water directly away from this area. So to sort of wrap this up, again, another graphic that you just have to trust me, it's going to show what I'm going to say. The line that you see at the far left, that starts at the top, that was 1920s to 1950s before Friant came online. That was the groundwater table for a lot of Friant districts. It was dropping. All the blue shaded area there, those are deliveries that start happening once Friant Dam was built, once Friant Canal came on. So what you see is the groundwater table in the area that was getting deliveries wasn't flat, but it started to stabilize. We have reliability. Friant water comes in, you have reliability of deliveries. That's how a conjunctive use area should work. And if we're getting all of our Friant water, more areas are going to see stability in the groundwater. The drought years, you have to rely on it. The wet years, it comes back, and it's pretty flat. So why are we still seeing this? This was one of my earlier graphs. Why are we still seeing continued drop in overdraft? Well, is it because we're using more water? People say, oh, well, all these investors, they have more water is being used. Well, the PPIC did a study that showed, well, in reality, since 1988 to 2017, farm water use has been about the same. Hasn't, it's up and a little bit, but it's been about the same. So it's not really because of that. Well, we know why. If you look at the areas that are most overdrafted, that's where the Delta is. That's where the deliveries come from the Sacramento River, and it's imported by design to this area and the west side of the San Joaquin Valley. And that has gone down significantly. So this illustrates the blue bar is from 1952 to 1992. Basically, all of the deliveries of the Central Valley Project were at about 100% of what it was designed to do. After 1992, it went down to about 75% of what it was designed to deliver through 2006. And then after 2007 until present, it's at about 32% of what it was designed to deliver. That's well in excess of 1 million acre-feet a year that was supposed to be delivered through the Delta to the valley. That because it's not, it is affecting you. It's affecting the west side of the valley harder, but it is having an effect on everybody. And so just, we at Friant call this the golden trophy chart, because This shows it kind of breaks out that last chart, but it provides some detail as to why are we losing? Why is it only 30%? Is it because the facilities are failing, or we're just getting different hydrology? What's going on? Well, every one of these bars represents a new regulation that was put in place, either from, as I look through this, there's a state board requirement, then there was an ESA, Endangered Species Act requirement, and a federal law came in that required, and another ESA, then another state board, then another ESA, then another ESA, and then another ESA. And if you've heard of the voluntary agreements, which I'm not going to say how I feel about voluntary agreements, myself in trouble. But all I would say about it factually is it's the next state board action that will produce another golden trophy. Because every one of these bars represents almost all of them deals that were cut that people that represented the farmers in the Central Valley agreed to. And they agreed to it because it's always their threatened worse. And so they agreed to a new regulation that just takes a little bit more. But this is what a little bit more looks like over 50 years. And what it ends up with is the red of groundwater overdraft keeps getting worse. So the key message, as I'll close here, is that as you think about finalizing your GSPs and trying to get to sustainability, which is absolutely critically important, realize that also what's important is the fight that's going on in the Delta to maintain and improve the deliveries that the state and federal governments have promised us that continue to get whittled away. And every time it gets whittled away, you might have a GSP, you might think it's sustainable now. If there's another regulation that comes in place, it's less water for the valley, it means you're going to have to even cut back more after that. So I would encourage you to think about not only focusing on your GSPs, but also how are the agencies that represent you fighting in the Delta to make sure that we stop this trend of losing water due to regulation, because it is possible. And if you don't know who's fighting, wouldn't it be great if we had one entity that was just trying to get like the Westlands and the Friants and the different water agencies all together to say, look, we're going to have to unite and fight on this. Well, that's why we formed the water group in the Central Valley. So if you haven't heard of that, that is something we should all continue to support, because it is our #1 goal. Bring those deliveries back to where we can be more sustainable here, but we have to unite. We can't just fight in our little silos. So anyway, hopefully that helps a little bit to put in some context, the broader Central Valley project, how it fits this area and Friant, why we certainly believe the deliveries we provide out of North are so important. So thank you.